PC, yay! Okay, so we're going to be looking at phosphorus today. So phosphorus is, again, essential for life. So without phosphorus, you can't kind of form these amino acid type things, which are important for things like DNA. The rock form of phosphorus is mostly this mineral apatite. But we'll go on and see kind of how it's used and how it cycles through the land, kind of, and how it cycles through the ocean, and then, and how we've kind of maybe perturbed the cycle a little bit more. So it's essential for life. Okay, so it forms kind of key molecules that life has to have for it to work. So things like DNA, things like cell walls. So every molecule of a cell wall has a phosphorus on it. So these are phospholipids that make up the cell walls in all of your cells. It's important for this molecule ATP, adenosine triphosphate and diphosphate. So these are molecules which are absolutely crucial for cells in every living organism to basically store energy, okay, and use that energy later on. So it's kind of like why plants can kind of like do photosynthesis and then store that energy somehow chemically and then use it as something else. Some parts of animals are also made of things made out of phosphate, so hydroxyapatites, the stuff that kind of teeth are made from. Some bones also are rich in phosphorus. So without enough of this element, all of these things can't happen. Okay, so it's really critical, and there's this idea that it can be limiting for growth. So it's kind of like the all-you-can-eat buffet analogy, right? So you've got lots and lots of kind of available carbon, available light, energy that life can do its thing. So it could like eat all of that up, but it can't do that if you've basically taken away the critical element, okay, or any one of these critical elements. If you don't have any nitrate, nothing will happen. If you don't have any phosphate, nothing will happen. If you don't have other elements that are critical for life, iron, we'll see sulfur also. If we run out of any of those, then that stops life happening. Okay, so this is just an example of this. Well, this is those molecules, adenosine diphosphate and triphosphate. And these basically act by exchanging a phosphorus group on and off this molecule. Okay, that basically acts as a chemical battery. It stores energy that can then be used very easily for something else. Okay. Okay, so the stocks of phosphorus. So with the carbon cycle, there was a large stock of carbon in the atmosphere and a large stock dissolved in the ocean. And similarly for nitrogen, there was a large stock in the atmosphere and a large stock dissolved in the ocean. Okay, so these are sometimes thought of as, I guess, the kind of gaseous cycles, okay, because they have a significant component of the transformations of one form of the element into another that goes through the atmosphere, goes through a gaseous phase. Okay, but with phosphorus, that's not true, okay, because there is no atmospheric phosphorus. There is no gaseous form of that element, so it can't be in the atmosphere. Okay. There is some in the ocean, okay? There's some in biology, okay? But the biggest store of phosphorus is basically locked away in rocks, okay? So you can see here that one of the problems that we're going to have with this kind of this nutrient cycle is that the thing that we want and need for life is locked away in rocks, okay? And life does happen in rocks, but not a lot. Okay, most of the life happens up here in the ocean and in the biosphere, hence the kind of name. So that's where we've got to get the phosphorus to. Okay. Okay, so the forms of phosphorus. So we've mentioned that it's kind of locked up in these minerals that are in rocks. Okay, some of the phosphorus ends up being stuck onto dust particles. It's in teeth and things like that. But the main chemically available forms of phosphorus are these orthophosphate ions. Okay, so just like with carbon dissolved in water, we've got this series of reactions that can basically transform phosphate into these different forms, from kind of phosphate all the way through to phosphoric acid. Okay, And those reactions are dependent on the chemistry of the solution. So to go up the atmosphere, so there is actually this some phosphorus in the atmosphere in a gaseous form in this form of phosphine gas, which is incredibly rare in the atmosphere. It's the stuff that if you're cooking meth badly, it gets given off. But other than that, there are no gaseous forms in the atmosphere. The only phosphorus in the atmosphere is the stuff that's basically the solids, that are basically little bits of rock that are as dust in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's the only phosphorus in the atmosphere. The hydrosphere, so basically the oceans and lakes and rivers and stuff like that, we have these inorganic forms of phosphorus, phosphoric acid, hydrogen diphosphate, and just plain old phosphate. And then in the biosphere, okay, phosphorus is taken up into all of these organic compounds. So it basically forms part of cell walls. So these long lipid chains that build up your cell walls, and actually those are quite persistent in the environment. So even when you die and your cells kind of break down, the lipid part of, so basically the fatty parts of your cells, they can last quite a long time in the environment, so they're quite persistent. But also things like bones, teeth and shells, or tells as we like to call them. And then in the lithosphere, most of the phosphorus is locked up in this specific one mineral, apatite, which is a calcium phosphate mineral. But it's also quite rich because quite a lot of phosphorus is in biological material, in organic carbon, effectively. Okay, if you have rocks that have then got a lot of organic carbon in them, those rocks will be rich in phosphorus. Okay, so one of our basically when we're mining phosphorus out of the ground, we're either looking for deposits that have got a lot of apatite in them. Okay, so some of these are kind of related to magmatic systems, or we're looking for sedimentary rocks that are very rich in organic carbon. Okay, and then have also got some phosphorus in them. Okay, well, we've got go on to that a little bit more, some detail later on, but again, we're going to just go through and describe some of these cycles. I should just, I think I've got it in next lecture, but I've got a thing explaining kind of what we're actually, so that this teragram is kind of a 10 to the minus, 10 to the 12 grams, and how that relates to a gigaton, which is a slightly different, it's 1,000 times more. But there'll be a table in next week's, tomorrow's, even fact, tomorrow's lecture will have those in. Okay, anyway. So this is a description of the stocks. Okay, so we've got some in the ocean, and we've got rocks that can be mined, and then stuff's in the biosphere in either plants or in soils. Okay. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we go. This is mining some sedimentary rock that's got a lot of organic carbon in, or enough organic carbon to make it economically possible. So there's a person kind of scale kind of down there. Just about to see. So mining phosphorus is important because if we want to sustain all of the agriculture that we have, okay. So I mentioned yesterday that approximately half of the biological production of crops that we eat, okay, that's supported by the production of basically man-made fertilizers. Through that Bosch-Haber process, we're basically fixing nitrogen. Okay, we're making nutrient out of effectively thin air. But we can't do that for phosphorus, okay? And we need phosphorus, okay? Because just like we need nitrogen, you can't just have one of the nutrients, you have to have them all. So because we're creating this nitrogen that we're using for agriculture, we also need an extra source of phosphorus. Okay, but the only extra source of phosphorus is mining. I guess there was a world shortage in phosphorus. Okay, so lots of money has gone into kind of like finding deposits of this sort in places where it doesn't matter if you just dig up the landscape. Because the concentration of phosphorus in these rocks is quite low. So actually, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think there was an announcement there's going to be a new mine in Northumberland which will solve the world's problems of phosphates because they found a huge deposit that's going to be mined underground rather than open cast, and that's going to solve all our problems in terms of our phosphate demand, particularly in Europe, but they're going to be exporting worldwide. So just to point out, so operations like this are required if we want to eat stuff. Okay, and we all like eating stuff, particularly me. So the natural way that phosphorus basically gets into the environment is not mining. Okay, it's weathering. Okay, so here's a picture of some basalts, and there's the biosphere on top of the basalts, and you can kind of see this kind of orangey kind of layer. Okay, that's the basalts are weathering, and as they're weathering, they're releasing the phosphorus that's in that rock. Okay, so that's this very slow process, but it is responsible for effectively the natural flux of phosphorus into the kind of the biological available pool. Okay, so these are the so we basically through either mining or natural weathering, we're basically producing calcium phosphate, or calcium phosphate is in the rock, ultimately. And then there's some weathering, and in this case, basically hydrogen, carbonic acid is attacking the rock and dissolving it and forming these dissolved species here. Okay? Now, all of these ions are soluble in water. Okay, and this is kind of good because that makes them biologically available. Plants can kind of like absorb, can basically take up that water that has those nutrients in it. But the problem is that, if it can dissolve in water, it can be washed off the land very easily. Okay, so that's one problem. And also, that's not the only thing that happens. So it can be taken up, but once it's dissolved in water, chemical reactions can happen to these phosphates that basically remove them back into some solid phase. Okay, so they're both soluble, but they're also highly reactive. Okay, and there's this basically environmental control on what happens to the phosphate ions once they get released into water. Okay, so if we've got a very, very low pH. Okay, so if we've got an acidic kind of soil, the phosphate sticks onto iron, and iron oxide surfaces. So if you remember back to the, let's just flick back to this diagram here. It's a picture. You can see that this red coloration in the soil. Okay, that's because the soil has got a lot of iron in it. And almost all soil has quite a lot of iron in it because there's a lot of iron in the lithosphere, and that's right next to the soil. So the problem is that if we have a low pH in the soil, okay, the dissolved phosphate sticks onto these iron oxides, okay, and then it's no longer dissolved, so plants can't kind of eat it. And at a high pH, so if we move over to this side of the diagram, then if there's a lot of calcium in the soil, and there always is calcium in the soil because it's a major element, the phosphate starts to react with calcium, okay, and it effectively starts to reform those calcium phosphates apatite, which are unavailable. It's a solid, so that can't be uptaken by plants. So what this diagram is showing you here is that at different pHs, okay, the proportion of total phosphorus in the system from 0 to 100 is in different phases. Okay, so high pH, it's mostly in calcium-rich phases, okay, that are not dissolved, and in low pH, it's mostly in iron oxides and aluminium oxides. Across all pHs, some of it might stick to clay minerals, okay, or actually in between the layers in clays. And actually, it's this narrow band at the bottom, okay, that is the stuff that plants can actually take up. Okay, so once you've done your weathering, you've produced some like nice, tasty phosphates that can be used by plants. Okay, almost 90% of that is then suddenly made unavailable. It's stuck onto other things. It's stuck onto oxides or calcium minerals, and only 90% of it is 90% of it. 10% roughly down the bottom, is actually available for life to use. Okay? And actually, the pH of the soil is then really important for determining how much is available. So at low pH, okay, less phosphorus is available than at kind of a moderate pH, and then at high pH, less phosphorus is available again. So this is one of the reasons why, as well as like farmers putting nutrients onto their fields to boost production, they also care about what the pH of the soil is. Okay, so you might see farmers spreading lime on their fields to try and, if they've got acidic soil, to raise it up to a more neutral pH, okay, to basically to make more of the phosphorus that's there available, because it's much cheaper to change the pH of your soil than add loads and loads of phosphorus to the soil that's just going to get locked up and not going to be available for your plants. So this is a kind of a double-edged sword in that this fact that we're basically we have to spend a lot of energy and effort either mining phosphorus or the natural world weathering rocks, and then most of it suddenly becomes unavailable. Okay, so that makes it less efficient, but it's kind of a good thing in that all of these forms of phosphorus, okay, aren't able to be washed away, okay, because they are stuck onto particles. Okay, so this keeps a stock of phosphorus available to plants, well, kind of semi-available, in that once it's in this phase, or this phase, or this phase, it can't be used by plants. Only this phase can be used by plants, but this stuff can be washed away. So if you have like lots of rain leaching through your soil, you might wash away this stuff, leaving you with no phosphorus available for plants. But then it's a lot easier to convert phosphorus from one of these phases down into the soluble phase, or one of these phases down to the soluble phase, than it is to create new phosphorus from weathering of rocks. So it kind of creates this kind of semi-available pool of phosphorus which plants can kind of get going with or use, which is quite nice. So this is what we might see in a soil profile. So you can see here's a soil pit, and there's kind of a layer that's kind of rich in iron, okay, and that's iron itself is being kind of leached out of the soil, and then it's basically reaching some horizon, maybe the water table, which is kind of causing it to either oxidize or to be dissolved there more and then reprecipitate as these iron oxides. And what happens is you've got some iron with an oxygen kind of sticking out of it, maybe some more oxygens are off there, maybe some other ions over here in some kind of amorphous mineral. Well, that's not an amorphous mineral, it's a bit of an oxymoron, but some basically microcrystalline phase of iron. So it's not necessarily a regular crystal structure, but it will have these iron oxide groups on the outside of it, and the phosphate can basically share an oxygen between those and kind of stick on. And that sticking on can be either with one oxygen, or sometimes you get kind of like a double bonded, it's not double bonded, but two oxygen bonds there to bind the phosphorus on a little bit more tightly. Or you can maybe sometimes bind them with aluminium oxides. Okay, so this is basically a store of phosphorus in this iron-rich layer here that could potentially become available if you kind of slightly change the pH or different amounts of water and stuff like that. And just the stuff over on this side is just an example of how these kind of reactions are used for people that like to keep fish or stuff in tanks. So if you keep fish in a tank, there will be lots of nutrients in the water because you might fill your tank up from tap water, which will have some nutrients in, or you might put some fish food in and all that kind of stuff. And if your tank gets too many nutrients in, you might have lots of algal growth in your tank, which would be bad. So there's the product you can buy called Phosban, which is basically sand that's coated in iron oxides, and you put that in your fish tank, and what it does is it basically scavenges all of the phosphorus from the water, lowers the concentration of phosphorus. So you could have lots of other nutrients in your tank, you could have lots of nitrate, lots of sulfate in your tank, but no algae could grow because there's no phosphorus available for them. Okay? So by removing the phosphorus from the system, you limit the amount of biological activity that can go on. Okay, so this is basically the chemistry of these different phosphorus species. So you can see here that let's give myself a little pointer so that makes it more obvious. This H3PO4, that's phosphoric acid. okay? And that will dissociate into hydrogen ion and dihydrogen phosphate, which will then dissociate further to a hydrogen ion and hydrogen phosphate, and then will dissociate further into hydrogen ion and phosphate. Okay, but you can see that each of these reactions is releasing a hydrogen ion, which makes the equilibrium position of these. So if we were to write out a chemical equilibrium for each of these steps, say the concentration of products over the concentration of reactants, or the activity actually of products over the activity of reactants, that would make the equilibrium position dependent on the activity of the hydrogen ions, concentration of the hydrogen ions if you like, which makes determining which of these chemical species pH dependent. Okay? So that's one thing that's kind of important. And then we can then think about what actually happens to the calcium way of locking up these compounds. So if we have calcium with a phosphoric acid, okay, that will potentially react together to form this calcium kind of phosphoric acid thing over here that looks like this at the top. Okay, and you can kind of see that the calcium in these groups are less well bound together, okay, than these other ones down the bottom, which basically have have taken the phosphate and joined it twice to the calcium. Okay, and depending on the pH, as you go down in pH, you progressively react these calcium kind of phosphates with either calcium carbonate or just calcium in solution, and they progressively form these different calcium minerals. Okay, so you start with this one, you go down to this one, you go down to this one, this one, this one, this one. And what this does is it effectively, as you increase the pH, you're changing the form of calcium phosphate into a form that is essentially more securely locked away. Okay? It's less soluble in water, so it's more likely to precipitate out onto surfaces of minerals, and it's also harder to break apart again. Okay? So because all of these reactions, or that basically because the species of phosphate available is pH dependent, the pH controls which one of these minerals you get. So at higher pH, we tend to form these insoluble calcium phosphate phases. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there's no equivalent of nitrogen fixation. So there's no phosphate fixation. We can't make bioavailable phosphate. We have to produce it by weathering or mining. So it's often limiting the amount of biological availability. pH is really important in determining how available the phosphorus that you have weathered is for biology. So at low pH, we're sticking things onto these iron phases. At high pH, we're forming these calcium kind of phosphate phases. So only at this kind of relatively neutral pH do we have the optimum amount of phosphorus available for life to kind of do its thing. I mean, that being said, that does then create a pool of phosphorus that's in these kind of semi-available phases, that if you do change the pH, then they can become available again. Also, actually, if you start to bind phosphorus into kind of organic kind of compounds, particularly if you have lots of organic acids hanging around, those can complex the phosphorus and keep it in solution. So in an organic rich kind of environment, say soils, then you can actually slightly increase the availability of phosphorus just by having lots of organic matter present. Okay. There we go. Okay, so that's basically, we've just described this stock of phosphorus, that's kind of bound up in soils and is kind of either available or in these calcium phases or iron phases. There's also a stock which is basically us mining rock out. Okay, so that's basically a weathering type flux. And then I mentioned that quite a lot of this phosphorus was then soluble. Okay, so once it's in the soil, it can be leached out into rivers, okay, and flow out into the sea. Okay, so the riverine flux of phosphorus is quite high compared to the other nutrients and carbons. So compared to nitrogen, okay, we might be using 20% of the available nitrogen, and that's because we can carry on replacing it with nitrogen fixation, whereas with phosphorus, we are losing proportionally more of that nutrient to the ocean. Okay, so keeping it on land is kind of critical. Okay, and just as how much we've changed that, we've basically, through our agricultural activities, through mining, putting it on fields, we've effectively doubled the riverine flux of phosphorus to the ocean. Okay, so to conclude the land cycle, phosphorus is really scarce. Okay, it's really hard to get available, and then it partitions into these unavailable or partially available phases, which are really importantly controlled by pH. Okay, so this is kind of summarized on a kind of like a diagram. We start out with rocks here. Okay, we do some weathering, and that could be like natural weathering or mining. We produce these soluble forms. Okay, and then some of those are just washed straight out to sea. Okay, some of them get taken up into plants, eaten by animals, and that decays. Okay, there's this internal cycling. Okay, so this production of it's not really new, of used phosphorus, say, through kind of the decay of plants, the decay of animals, releasing phosphorus back into the soil where it can be used again. That's really important, just like it was really important for nitrogen. Okay, but we also have this kind of like stock of phosphorus that's bound up in the soil on these secondary mineral phases, on iron oxides and calcium phases, where we can actually kind of somewhat replenish the available source of phosphorus. Okay? Okay, so we're going to move off into the ocean phosphorus cycle. So this is the ocean. That's Bass Rock near North Berwick, and you'll see why Bass Rock is important later on. So we've got this flow of phosphorus from rivers into the ocean. We also have some atmospheric dust. So the phosphorus that's bound up in all these mineral phases in soil. Okay, if you start blowing away the soil, forming kind of like dust clouds like we have in dusty areas, I guess. Some of that dust will get blown over the ocean. Okay, so that's kind of like an atmospheric transport of solid bits of phosphorus out into the ocean. We also have this river flow. Okay, so this is an example of a dust plume. This is Africa. There's the Canary Islands over on the far side if you care about the Canary Islands. But you can see this big plume of dust being blown off the land over the ocean. And that's basically made up of extremely fine sand and silt particles. And those particles, as you can see, this is just a picture of some sand, but you can see it's orange, and that's because quite a lot of even the sand particles are coated with iron oxides. And it's those iron oxides which have basically maybe some of them have got a phosphorus stuck to them. Okay, so this is a potential source of phosphorus to the ocean. Okay, so we've got the rivers as well. Okay, and rivers have got lots of phosphorus in them because it's very soluble. Unfortunately, most rivers have got like a pH of between 5 and 8, somewhere around 7. Neutral pH river water. It's kind of fresh water. But when they get to the ocean has got a pH of currently just 8.1. Okay, so that rise in pH is going to affect the solubility of that phosphorus. Okay, there's also a lot of calcium in the ocean. It's almost an unlimited amount of calcium in the ocean if you're a phosphorus atom. So what happens is as soon as the phosphorus gets to the ocean, the pH rises and it goes, ooh, I quite like the look of that calcium, and then, and it sticks onto that calcium, form these insoluble calcium phosphates, and they precipitate out in estuaries. Okay, so that means that of that 20-odd teragrams of phosphorus a year, only about 2 get into the actual ocean. Okay, so we have this basically phosphorus trap in estuaries. Okay, now if we look at how we're going to go into the future, if the oceans are becoming more acidic because we're putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, maybe we might actually get a little bit more phosphorus coming into the ocean because this phosphorus trap will become less efficient because the pH change is going to be less. But that's for another day. Okay, so this is our reduced flux actually into the ocean. So the ocean is kind of not looking in such a happy place for phosphorus because it's only got a little bit coming in dust. and most of that is solids. And of our available phosphorus, we've only got 2 teragrams a year coming in the ocean. So when it gets into the ocean, it gets used by biology, by phytoplankton take it up, it gets moved up through the food web. And one of the really interesting things about kind of life in the ocean is that, unlike on land, almost everywhere in the ocean, nitrogen and phosphorus are taken out of the water in a constant ratio. So on land, kind of different plants have different slightly requirements for how much nitrogen or how much phosphorus they need. And actually different organisms in the ocean too. So different types of phytoplankton might need a slightly more amount of nitrogen than phosphorus. But everywhere in the ocean, on average, the whole population of primary producers seem to take up nitrogen and phosphorus at this constant ratio of 16 nitrogens for every 1 phosphorus. And if you look at maps of the phosphate distribution and the nitrate distribution at the top here, you can see in the surface ocean and in the slightly deeper ocean, you get exactly the same pattern. Okay? And if you look at the scales, the scale of the phosphorus ones are 1/16 of the scale of the nitrate ones at the top, which is a bit weird. And this is, I mean, we don't really know why. Okay? But although they have different sources, these nutrients tend to be kind of very uniformly distributed because they're used, and the internal cycling of these elements is very, very similar. Okay? We'll do more about this if you do oceanography. If you don't, well, there we go. So we can just go through one of these kind of calculations to see how much phosphorus we're getting into the ocean and how much we need. So marine primary productivity, 60 gigatons of carbon per year. We can work out how much phosphorus is required for that. So that's 60 times 10 to the 15 divided by 12 divided by 106. So the ratio of for every 1 phosphorus we have in the ocean, we can take up 106 carbon dioxides or 106 carbon atoms if we have 16 nitrogen atoms. So that we can work out how many moles per year of phosphorus we need, okay, and then we can convert that into how many grams, okay, so that's 1.5 times 10 to the 13, but so this is how much we need. We need 1,500 teragrams of phosphorus a year. And we've just found out that we only have 3. Okay, so 3 is not enough for 15. I mean, you can definitely see those numbers are different. And that's, once again, the importance of this internal cycling. Okay, so we're taking both types of internal cycling. So we're basically cycling nutrients are being formed, are being taken up in the surface ocean. Okay, life is then forming some organic material which sinks down to the deep ocean. Okay, which forms basically, the deep ocean is rich in nutrients. And again, you can see that the Atlantic is less concentrated than the Pacific and Indian Ocean because those oceans, the deep water has been down there longer, has accumulated more nutrients from raining organic material down from below. But we also have cycling within the surface layer where plants grow, decay, release their nutrients. There's growth, decay, they release their nutrients without the material actually having to sink. Okay, so there's, I think on the next, we don't want that one. Oh, so the importance of upwelling. So so in regions where that deep water can get to the surface, these are one of the ways we're actually adding phosphorus to the surface ocean, and therefore life can happen there. So these are very productive biological regions here. So effectively we get added phosphorus into the surface ocean by taking organic matter that's being produced in the surface, it sinks down, it gets dissolved, or sometimes referred to as remineralized, so into the inorganic phases of phosphate. Those can then upwell, and we might get some more biological activity over here. But we can also cycle phosphorus within the surface layer of the ocean as well. Okay. So this internal cycling, both deep internal cycling and the shallow internal cycling, is absolutely critical for how much kind of carbon can be taken out of the atmosphere. Okay, so that's this internal cycling flux, okay, which is massive. Okay, so we're going to talk about outputs now. So we talked about inputs. The only output for phosphorus, because it doesn't have a gaseous phase, the only way it can get out of the ocean is if something eats some organic material, okay, and then flies over land and then poops it out. Okay? Which is why Bass Rock was important, because all of that guano covering Bass Rock, okay, it's not snowy on Bass Rock, it's just bird shit, that is an export of phosphorus from the ocean. Okay? And it is effectively the main export. So bird poo is really important for determining how much phosphorus is in the ocean. Okay? And at some point, it used to be our only source of fertilizer. Okay? It's one of the reasons why the British Navy went around kind of conquering lots of small islands in the Pacific, because they were covered in guano. And we dug it up. We didn't dig it up. We got some friendly natives to dig it up for us. I'm joking, they weren't natives, of course. We took them from Africa. We were just mining it, okay? And that was the really important source of phosphorus, okay? I guess I should probably also say that there's also an output to sediments at the bottom of the ocean as well, because any sediment that's being produced that has any organic matter in it will also have some phosphorus in it, okay? So this is... So these are some rocks that are kind of rich in phosphorus. So you have these phosphatic type rocks, which are basically rocks that are made up entirely of fossilized poo. Okay, it's not necessarily bird poo. It could be something that's deposited in the ocean. Bone beds. So these are some quite big dinosaur bones, but also quite often you get beds which are very, very rich in things like fish teeth. So those are also good sources of phosphorus for mining out. Organic rich rocks will have some phosphorus in. And then there's also sometimes you get this type of deposit where you've had a lot of guano deposited on land, okay? And then because the phosphate in that is actually quite soluble, okay, it basically makes the groundwater underneath that very, very rich in phosphate, okay? And if that groundwater seeps through and finds a rock that's got a lot of calcium in it, like a limestone, okay, you can start to precipitate out those calcium-rich phosphate phases on your limestone. So it's kind of like a diagenetic process. Okay, so that is thought to be one of the main reasons, the main mechanisms of formation of some of these really, really rich or high concentration phosphate deposits, which are good for mining out on a large industrial scale. So it's basically a diagenetic form of phosphate. Okay, so to conclude the ocean cycle, so it really is that the sources are really, really small. Okay, we get some phosphorus blown in on dust, we get some in rivers, but we lose the stuff from rivers almost as soon as it enters the ocean, so we only get 2 teragrams of phosphorus a year that way. So the internal cycling, okay, this upwelling of deep water and also just reuse in the surface layer, that's really, really important. Okay, and the only outputs are sediments of bird poo and organic rich rocks. Okay, so just think about how we've changed these cycles. So I've mentioned this a bit already. So effectively chopping down lots and lots of trees, that increases the amount of runoff and erosion. So we're basically increasing the amount of weathering, physical and chemical. Okay, so that's increasing the flux down rivers. Okay, so although most of that is trapped in estuaries, some of it is getting through to the ocean. We're effectively making an artificial weathering by mining rocks and specifically targeting phosphorus-rich rocks and then putting them on the land, letting them dissolve and then go into the ocean. Another really important source of phosphorus to the ocean, particularly in coastal zones around kind of large centres of population, is actually sewage and wastewater. So stuff that we produce, because we are kind of organic material, we're producing lots of organic material that has phosphorus in it. Okay? And that gets into the ocean, and as the organic carbon is broken down, the phosphorus is released. Okay? So the putting basically sewage into the ocean adds phosphorus. And with nitrogen, okay, we put nitrogen as well, but we can treat the water for nitrogen, okay, by anaerobically using the Anammox system or using a denitrification method. We can convert the nitrogen-based nutrients into a gas, okay, and that goes into the atmosphere and not into the ocean. But with phosphorus, we can't do that, Okay? It's very hard to remove phosphorus from wastewater. We have to do something. We have to either pass it through a chemical filter where we actually try and scavenge the phosphorus onto iron oxides, okay, which is very expensive. And actually, some of the pieces of research that are being done in this department by Kate Heel, who's one of the professors, she's actually trying to develop new ways of making material out of things like charcoal and mining waste to make a substance that can actually trap phosphorus if you just basically flow your wastewater over it. So this is a big challenge, cleaning up our wastewater. Okay? Because if it gets into the like lakes, rivers, and estuaries, we have this problem of having too many nutrients, and we get these big algal blooms. So just to show this is I think probably one of the most powerful kind of environmental activism type photos that's ever been produced. So we used to have this problem that our wastewater had loads and loads of phosphorus in it, and that's because we used phosphorus in detergents. Okay, because it's really good for softening water, it's really good for cleaning. But the problem is that a whole bunch of lakes and rivers and stuff over North America were starting to look like this, okay, where they had lots and lots of algal growth, removed the oxygen from the water when it decayed. So the Canadian government decided that they'd have this experimental lakes area. Because Canada's really, really big, okay, if they start to do some experiments and playing with their lakes, no one will notice because no one ever goes there. It's really big. So this is lake number 226. That gives you kind of an idea of how many lakes they had to play with. And the experiment they did was they put a barrage across the lake, okay, that went all the way down to the bottom, split the lake into two, and into one half of the lake they just dumped nitrate and phosphate, and into the other half of the lake they just put nitrate. So they've added nutrients to both halves of the lake, but life only really kind of went nuts where you had both nitrogen and phosphorus. If you limit one of the nutrients, it doesn't matter how much of the other nutrients that you have. Okay? And they did this experiment. They did a whole bunch of actual science, looking at the oxygen concentrations, the amount of life, all this kind of stuff, some ecological surveys. But this photo is so compelling because it's so obvious that this is bad and that is good. Okay? And basically this photograph led to the legislation which basically started to reduce the use of phosphorus in detergents. Okay? So that's so photographs are very important for convincing people that they're doing bad things. Okay, so to conclude, there's some conclusions. So no atmospheric component except phosphine gas from meth labs in New Mexico. The sedimentary cycle is really important. Okay, so weathering and sedimentation are the main ins and outs of the phosphorus cycle. River flow and runoff are important, but then when it gets to the ocean, we have this pH control. Okay, so at high pH we form calcium phosphates, which remove phosphorus from the water. And also pH is really important for controlling the availability on land. Okay, if it's too high, everything's locked up in iron oxides. If it's too low, if pH is too high, everything's locked up in calcium phosphates. If it's too low, everything's locked up in iron oxides. So one of the main differences between the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle is this: you can't just make nutrient out of thin air like you can with nitrogen. Okay. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. So there's two things I wanted to say to you, kind of like admin-wise. So the course evaluation surveys, which is kind of how you tell us, we'd like this, we didn't like this. Basically, you give like Steve, me, and Brian a score, and it kind of demotivates us, and that's kind of great. Steve always wins. It's very depressing because he's very good, right? So I don't think this is yet live because they're slightly fiddling around with the actual questions that they're going to ask you this year. So this will, I think, maybe appear next week via one of the many emails you get. But to get to it, you go to MyEd somewhere, and it's on like a hidden in a thing. But if you can find it, please do fill it out. We do actually find the information that you give us useful. That's quite nice. And the other thing is this, which is a separate kind of way of feeding back. So these are these teaching awards. So if you Google USER Teaching Awards, you'll get to this page. And there are a whole bunch of categories. So you can like nominate, like if you think this is, you've only had 3 courses, right? So one of them is the best, nominate that one. It won't be the maths course, right? You can nominate all this stuff, like best tutor, best lecturer. I don't really care about this at all, but one of the categories is the PhD student or students that, what are the actual categories? Best student who tutors. I think this one here. Okay, so these are some of the tutors that we've had this year for the Phosphorus part. I think these are these people. So if you can't remember their names, I put their pictures in the back of the thing so you can remember the names, because you have to type their name in. And the people that are doing the chemistry part, and for those of you that are actually doing the maths, obviously the lecturing doesn't really help much, but I think these people have helped a lot as well. So it really does actually make a difference to these guys if they get nominated from a teacher. It makes a bit of a difference for us as well. But so do think about doing that. It shouldn't take that long and whatnot. But there are their names, and you need to know their names. Oh, and yeah, so Matt now has blue hair. If you had like the guy with blue hair on Tuesday, he had blue hair and a red eye now. Anyway, okay, so I'll see you on tomorrow at 12. If you haven't signed in, please do that. It makes life slightly easier for me.